In today's show, we're talking Miami Heat with Wes Goldberg of the Locked On Heat podcast, Michael Bolton.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com and at Yahoo Sports Australia. And you can find me on Twitter, as always, at redrock_Beeble and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Thank you for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free and we are available on all platforms. We're going to talk Miami Heat in today's show. So there's some interesting things. Do they get better or worse? We'll find out. We'll find out what that means for some rotation decisions. And we're going to do that. I don't know why I'm waffling so much. We're going to get into that right now. Warnie?
Let's get it on, Gilly.
All right, let's bring him back in. He's been on this podcast many times, sometimes covering the Heat, sometimes covering the Golden State Warriors. We are back, though, to do the Miami Heat, and that is with one of the Locked On Heat co-hosts, and that is, of course, Wes Goldberg. Wes, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be back.
It's good to be here talking Heat this time. This time last year we were talking Warriors. We're talking Heat now. And it's a team obviously with high-level playoff expectations heading into the season after reaching the Eastern Conference Finals last season. And let's just start off how we start all these shows by looking at what happened in the offseason. And it's a barren list. In comes Nikola Jovic, Marcus Garrett, Darius Days, the last two on two-ways, and they lose PJ Tucker. Markieff Morris remains unsigned. Javonte Smart and Michael Mulder are gone. A whole lot of nothing really happening there, Wes.
A whole lot of nothing. This was a team that was pretty much in a holding pattern, trying to get Kevin Durant or Donovan Mitchell or some other star, and of course that did not happen. And so this is what they're left with. This is also a team that's, tried to stay out of the luxury tax. That was another one of their concerns too. So they let PJ Tucker walk. Markieff Morris never really found a spot in the rotation last year. They replaced Javonte Smart and Michael Mulder with Marcus Garrett and Darius Days. They draft Nikola Jovic. So some developmental prospects who are a little bit interesting down the line for this team. But this is a team that's going to be relying on the guys that were in the rotation last year and some internal development.
I guess the question there is PJ Tucker is gone. So legitimately, who is the power forward on this team? There isn't one. The only power forward on the team is this bloke they drafted at 27, and that's Nikola Jovic. I would highly doubt he's going to start. There's Haywood Highsmith, who's a 3. There's Caleb Martin, who's a 3. There's Jimmy Butler, who's a 3. Who's going to be? Who's going to play the 4?
You're right. Like, the only 4s on the roster are basically Nikola Jovic, who, when I asked him what position he thinks he is and about playing power forward, he called himself positionless, which is pretty good. For just sort of a messaging standpoint, but at some point you have to play a position, and for Miami it might have to be power forward.
Hey, that could also mean he has no position on the court at all.
Right, yeah, and again, you need to play one of the 5 spots at some point, and so I get it, but he's very raw. He's very young. The Heat don't expect him to make an immediate impact, and they didn't draft him with that in mind, by the way, even though they were not sure what was going to happen at that position. Darius Days, same sort of thing, kind of in the PJ Tucker mold on that 2-way contract. The Heat use their 2-way guys more than a lot of teams do. So I do expect guys like Darius Days and Marcus Garrett to get minutes here and there, but obviously not regular minutes unless something, crazy happens or some sort of injury opens that pathway. But you're right. Other than those guys who are developmental guys, they don't really have a real power forward on the roster. And so what'll end up happening is that responsibility will fall to Caleb Martin, who played mostly the wing position for them last year. They re-signed him with the mid-level exception, and he's their best bet, right? And look, it's not a great bet. He's 6'5", not very heavy. Doesn't, PJ Tucker's 6'5", but he's also 6'5" the other way too, 6'5" wide. Caleb Martin isn't that, right? And so he's a good player. It was nice to get him re-signed, but he's going to be that fill-in at that point. And obviously they're going to be going small with Jimmy Butler at the 4 a little bit here and there. But you can't do that with Jimmy Butler. Not at this age. You can't do it consistently, especially when you need him to perform the way that he did in the postseason last year to get you to the Eastern Conference Finals, right? You're basically asking this guy to put up 30 and 10 every single night. Well, he's not going to be able to do that in the postseason if he's worn down by playing the power forward spot all regular season long. And so he'll see some spot minutes there. So will Caleb Martin. It's going to be probably a committee approach, but I also think this is a team ripe to make a move mid-season and maybe address that spot.
Actually, I think Butler at the 4 probably is the better option. I don't think there's that. How many dangerous power forwards are there around the league that are going to bang and smash? I don't know. But he's taller than Caleb Martin. He's stronger than Caleb Martin. He's a worse shooter than Caleb Martin. He's like, why couldn't he play like a smaller sized LeBron sort of role? DeMar DeRozan played the 4 for the Spurs quite a bit as well. And his game and Jimmy is not that dissimilar. Yeah, is the 4 really that much of a physically taxing role in today's NBA?
I think in the Eastern Conference, when you look at the teams, yeah, there's Giannis. There's teams in their division that trend a little bit bigger between Atlanta and Orlando. There's definitely guys with some heft at that spot. Philadelphia is obviously a little bit bigger at that position now that they have PJ Tucker, and they can even downshift with Tobias Harris, who is sort of that tweener forward, but much bigger than Jimmy Butler even still. There's some guys for sure. But the other part about Miami's defense is it switches everything, right? At least it did last year. And we expect that to be the case this coming season. And so maybe there's a little bit less strain on somebody like Jimmy Butler if he's playing the 4, considering that, hey, if you just run like a 1-4 or a 2-4 sort of pick and roll, all of a sudden Jimmy is switched onto a guard, and that's much more easily manageable for him. But the other part of that is, well, if you're another team with a 4 who can handle the ball a little bit, even if they're a little bit smaller, you could put Jimmy Butler in a switch with another center on him and then get Jimmy pinned onto a center. And then Bam is left covering the ball handling forward/wing kind of guy, which is not a problem for Bam. But that's what PJ Tucker was so valuable in last year for Miami, was that he could handle those centers when he got switched onto him. And you don't really want Jimmy to be in those spots either, because then when you're talking about the centers in the East, now you're talking about Joel Embiid, talking about Robert Williams, you're talking about all these guys who are much bigger and much more of a problem there.
There's been a bit of buzz about Haywood Highsmith. Do you reckon there's any shot? And the Heat have no problem with these guys who nobody's heard of. Yeah, nobody is in the general casual fan. Nobody's heard of G League players. Just have to look up and down the roster. Caleb Martin, Max Strus, Duncan Robinson, Gabe Vincent, Omer Yurtseven. There's been so many guys. Hassan Whiteside, one of these guys, that's come in and they've just said, all right, well, we believe. See what you can do. Is Haywood Highsmith's got a little bit of that size? Is there any shot that they just say, well, go in, just see what you can do, get out there, play your 25 minutes as a starter, and we'll go from there?
I'm glad you brought him up because I didn't mention him before, and I probably should have. He really impressed Miami last year with his work ethic, and then the production was there during Summer League. It was Summer League, but that's something, right?
No,
we saw well. Max Strus. He played well, and Max Strus played well last summer. And that kind of paved the way, kind of got him on that track to eventually get some rotation spots. And then lo and behold, he was starting by the time the playoffs came around. That would probably be the best case scenario for Haywood Highsmith. But when you look at his size, he's listed between 6'6" and 6'8". I actually asked him about that. He's actually like in the middle at 6'7". It's some weird thing about his listing because he was listed too big or not big enough when he was in the G League, but whatever. He is bigger than Caleb Martin, probably even bigger than taller than probably Jimmy Butler, or around the same height. And I talked to him about it last year. He wants to model his game after PJ Tucker. And actually the Heat were molding him in that way when they called him up last season. They kind of looked at him as sort of the backup version of PJ Tucker. He never really carved out those minutes late last season, but that could be a role for him going forward this season. You asked me who I think would end up being the power forward for this team, at least starting. And I think right now the inside track is with Caleb Martin, but that is a spot that's going to be open in training camp for competition. And I think Haywood Highsmith would be the dark horse to go ahead and get it. I wouldn't rule it out. I'll put it that way. I would not rule out Haywood Highsmith somehow grabbing that power forward spot in the starting lineup.
It's an interesting spot. It's probably the weakest spot out of all of the contenders across the NBA, like weakest starting spot. So they're going to have to find a solution there. And maybe it is Highsmith. What about injuries? Are we all clear heading into the season?
Yeah, I think the only concern, it's not quite an injury, but the Kyle Lowry stuff that was lingering last year in terms of in the playoffs, but then the personal issues that he was dealing with. According to all reporting, that those personal issues are still present in his life at this point. And so that would probably be the only thing, is you wonder how much of an effect that will have this year, because Last season, we of course remember he had to miss quite a few games, quite a bit of time because dealing with those personal issues. So that would be the one thing I would say. But in terms of physical injuries, we are in the clear right now for the Heat.
That's always great news injury-wise, but yes, I think I've mentioned that on this show a few weeks ago about Lowry's personal issues potentially still being a problem this season, so it's obvious that we hope everything's all right and it can get resolved for him and his family, but it looks like that's going to have some sort of an impact at some point this season. We're going to come back and talk starting lineup in a second, Wes. Before we do that, a very important message. You're hanging out with some friends, and you're putting back a few drinks. A few becomes a few too many, and as the evening comes to an end, people start to head out. You think of calling for a ride, but you go, nah, I live nearby. I can make it home okay. It's no big deal. What are the odds I get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? Insurance goes up. You lose your license, you lose your job, you total your car, you kill someone. Everyone knows about the risks of driving drunk, and the results are tragic and often deadly. However, that still doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while they're under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives. So if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over. We've talked about this already, but I'll just put it up for completeness sake, Wes. Starting five, Kyle Lowry, Jimmy Butler, Caleb Martin, Bam Adebayo. But you think Tyler Herro is going to jump in there ahead of Max Strus?
I do. I think that there's quite a bit of pressure on Miami to see what it is that Tyler Herro looks like in the starting lineup. We remember a couple of years ago they tried him out in that starting lineup, but that was at the point guard spot, starting ahead of Goran Dragic. And eventually, well, not eventually, it took like about 2 weeks of the season. They went ahead and swapped that back around and put Dragic back in the starting lineup, Tyler Herro back on the bench. And then last year he won Sixth Man of the Year. We assume now with the Kevin Durant news being done and Donovan Mitchell probably not coming to Miami that this is pretty much the roster and that they're not going to make this superstar move. And so I think there's going to be some pressure on them to see if Tyler Herro could be that guy. They'll probably sign him to that extension now that they're not going to be dealing him potentially for a superstar. So you sign him to the extension. That'll kick in the following year, but that's a guy that you're going to see. Okay, is this guy going to be worth $20+ million a year from now? We got to see what he looks like in that starting lineup. And look, he was the best sixth man in the year, the best sixth man in the league last year, winning Sixth Man of the Year. And so you kind of earn a promotion, don't you? And so I think with also what the Heat have been looking for is more scoring next to Jimmy Butler, somebody who could take some of that scoring burden off of him. And so Tyler Herro kind of projects as the best answer to that problem, especially, again, they were looking for a star to potentially be that guy. They didn't find that guy. So what do you have on your roster that could best answer that question? And right now it is Tyler Herro.
It's going to be really intriguing to watch. He played 33 minutes a night coming off the bench, which are huge minutes. He averaged 21 points. I'm not convinced that it's better for him to be in the starting lineup. I think that playing more minutes, more crossover with Adebayo and Lowry and Butler impacts that high usage and scoring that he was able to parlay into what's probably going to be a max deal and into that Sixth Man of the Year award. I don't see how he repeats those numbers that he had last season, where he had way more opportunities to be the guy with the ball in his hands and to run things. And when you're in that starting lineup, Jimmy's going to handle it and Lowry's going to have it and distribute, and Bam's really good at that as well. And not saying Herro doesn't get his shots because he is the second best scorer out of that group, but I thought it worked so well. I don't know why you would change it. I agree with you that they're going to move that. It just feels that there's pressure coming from Herro and that they want him to start, and this is what's going to happen. I just don't know why you change it up.
Because you got to see what you have in him. I think that I agree with everything you're saying. He's going to have to get better in order to secure that starting job, right? You need to thrust him more responsibility. You got to put more on his plate and see if he can meet that challenge in a way that he couldn't a couple years ago. I do think that the team needs to maybe veer a little bit more away from the playmaking stuff with him because he's not a natural playmaker. And if you put him in a lineup with Kyle Lowry, Jimmy Butler, and Bam, those guys are natural playmakers, and that could ease the burden on Tyler Herro a little bit from doing that. And his catch and shoot numbers, his off-ball shooting numbers are really, really strong. And if you kind of tilt his game more in that direction, I think it makes a little bit more sense in the starting lineup, and that could ultimately be where his higher ceiling lies, is maybe more of a off-the-ball shooting threat to space the floor around guys like Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo, who could still do some stuff as a secondary ball handler slashing threat, kind of go up against a bent defense on the second side, and that kind of thing. But you're right. Like, it's going to be an adjustment for him, but there's a way that it works, and there's a way that it fixes Miami's offense, because when you don't have PJ Tucker, when you're already playing small with Jimmy Butler and Caleb Martin or Haywood Highsmith or whoever it's going to be at that 4 spot, this is a team that's going to need to make up the defensive deficiencies. I think they'll still be top 10 defensively, but they won't be elite the way that they were last year. So where do you make that up? Well, it's not going to come from Haywood Highsmith or Caleb Martin playing the 4. It's going to come from the offensive side. You're going to have to get better offensively, especially with the efficiency numbers. And Tyler Herro was an efficient, like I said, a very efficient off ball and catch and shoot 3-point shooter last year. So if you can do more of that in your offense, I think it'll be helpful. Also, just a fun fact with Tyler Herro, averaged the most fourth quarter minutes on the Heat last season. So playing against starters at the end of games in crunch time, not a new thing for him, especially playing with guys like Bam and Jimmy and Kyle, who are often in there at those points in the game too.
In the past with Herro, not to beleaguer the Herro stuff, but in the past, not so much last season, but where he really was able to put up big numbers was in games when Jimmy was out. So Jimmy would be out, Tyler Herro would step up and put up big numbers. And there'd been issues with his productivity starting in a lineup with Butler that he sort of just couldn't really find his spot. Now, that did change last season. They crossed over quite a bit. But in the past, when starting with Butler, from a fantasy perspective, Butler's out, Herro starting, that's great. Butler's in, Herro starting, that's not good. And that was quite a pattern that had happened prior to this year. So that will be intriguing to see how that happens. In terms of the rotation, guys, you've got Vincent, Strus, Oladipo, Highsmith, and Dedmon. There are 2 names that people will see are missing out of that group, which we are going to talk about a little bit later on, and that's Omer Yurtseven and, of course, Duncan Robinson. I want to focus here on Oladipo. He played like 8 games, I think, in the regular season, played in the playoffs somewhat. There's a lot of talk, oh man, I saw flashes of the old Vic. I don't really see that. What are you expecting? What are the Heat expecting from him bringing him back on that $11 million deal? What are they seeing from him? Or did you see the flashes that he could push into a large role and get the bulk of those bench minutes?
Well, that's the other reason why you move Tyler Herro into the starting lineup, is to open up that 6-man role for Victor Oladipo. They need to see what it is that they have in Victor Oladipo this season, because he has not had a training camp with Miami. They got him 2 years ago. He got re-injured. He missed all of training camp and obviously didn't play until the latter part of the season. Like you mentioned, only played the last handful of games of the regular season. And there were moments he scored 40-plus points against Orlando in the season finale. And some people kind of, threw that out. And it's like, well, it was the last game of the season. Nobody was playing their starters, whatever. But it's like 40 points in an NBA game is still sort of a big deal. And in the playoffs, the Heat relied on Victor Oladipo quite a bit. Now, there were definitely injuries to Kyle Lowry, to Tyler Herro, to Jimmy Butler at different points. And Victor Oladipo was healthy at that point. But I think they liked what they saw from him in terms of his on-ball defense and just his willingness to slash, to get to the basket, and to be a shot creator on a team that just doesn't have that many shot creators. When you look at guys like Bam Adebayo and Kyle Lowry, who have historically been a little reluctant to look for their own shot. Jimmy Butler in the regular season has been pretty passive too, even though in the playoffs that is not much of an issue. Tyler Herro was injured last year in the playoffs. And so Victor Oladipo played that role for them, where they just needed somebody else to be an outlet of offense. And so I think they liked what they saw from there, and there were flashes defensively. The 3-point shooting came and went. They'd like for that to be more consistent, but I think they're excited about what Victor Oladipo could look like with a full training camp and preseason, and an opportunity to go out and win some minutes and win a prime spot in this rotation. And I think, again, part of moving Herro into that starting lineup, which I don't mean to talk about this like it's a sure thing. Max Strus was starting by the end of last season. Tyler Herro is going to have to earn that job. But if you do move Herro into that starting unit, that opens up that space for Victor Oladipo to be the new 6th man of the year for Miami. And I think that's what they would like to do.
We'll talk about those other guys that I mentioned a little bit later on. This is not a young team. There's only one player that's under 22 on this roster, and that's including the two-way guys who are not, they're not super young players in Days, who is actually he's under 23, but he's not under 22, and Garrett, who's almost 24. The only guy is Jovic, who they picked there. This is they're great at developing players, but they're just going to develop him in the G League, I'm guessing, most of this year. Wes?
I think he'll spend a lot of time in the G League. They'll move him up and down as you do throughout the course of the season. They're high on his future, but yeah, like you said, this is a long-term play. A guy who projects well as a potential fit next to Bam Adebayo when you kind of look at what you want from that spot in that power rotation. But right now, yeah, not much of a factor in the rotation.
We're going to talk about some other interesting things with this team in just a second. But Wes, are you like me? Are you a long-suffering Miami Dolphins fan?
I am. I didn't realize you were too.
Yeah, we're pinning all our hopes to a good old Tua Tagovailoa this season. Yeah. But if you want to have a bet on any Miami Dolphins games or check the lines for any of their games, the number one place to go is betonline.net. It is your number one source for odds, lines, and games. In fact, we've got a game against the Eagles coming up this week on preseason action and 3.5-point favorite. So we'll see if that means anything, if Tua's even out there for that game, or if it's more of the Teddy Bridgewater show. But if you want to check anything, Major League Baseball, NFL, NHL, NBA, college sports, esports, combat sports, whatever, BetOnline continues to be that top online resource for all of your sports wagering information, live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have you covered. So head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action that's happening today. BetOnline is where the game starts, as my dog decides he wants to get up while I'm talking about BetOnline. All right, let's talk about this question. This is something I troll through. Troll is the wrong word. I look through, I lurk, maybe that's a better word, through plenty of teams' subreddits and see conversations going on with plenty of guys and YouTube videos of many teams. And this happens in the fantasy community as well. They go, why can't we play Omer Yurtseven? Why is Omer Yurtseven not playing? He'd be the perfect fit next to Bam Adebayo. That's what Bam's actually a 4, guys, and we'll play him next to Yurtseven. Oh, Yurtseven, he's going to be great. Fantasy people are saying this. Heat people are saying this. And then, of course, when Dedmon and Bam came back last season, Yurtseven went back to scratching his ass on the bench. Now, there's obviously a huge gaping hole there at the 4, which we talked about already, and people are going at it again. Well, why don't we just start Yurtseven and Bam together? So, can it actually happen?
I do think that Eric Spoelstra will experiment with Bam at the 4 because I think he's going to have to in certain matchups. And maybe in those matchups, Omer Yurtseven does get some run. But let's also remember, to your point, Dwayne Dedmon is also on this roster. They just signed him to a 2-year deal with a nice little chunk of money, by the way, which I'll get to why they did that here in a second. But the Omer Yurtseven part of it, they like his upside, but there's things that he needs to work on, specifically defensively. He needs to be able to keep up defensively, and he's just not there right now. He's a good scorer. He's a good rebounder, but defensively, he's just the foot speed isn't there. The overall strength isn't really there either to go up against a guy like Joel Embiid or something. And so when you talk about the matchups that you would be looking at to play Bam at the 4 with a more traditional 5, it would be against a team like Philly with Joel Embiid or a bigger team that has a hulking, threatening center, and you're really going to ask Omer Yurtseven to guard those guys? Probably not, at least not right now. And then as far as the Dedmon point, I think he's the guy that you pencil in as your backup center. That's why he's on the graphic there and not Yurtseven. But I also think that Dedmon could be a guy that Miami looks to trade at the deadline because you have him at a $4+ million salary. And that's a nice chunky piece that you can combine with another chunky salary and maybe do a 2-for-1 type of deal to upgrade this roster. And in that case, you would be giving half a season to Omer Yurtseven to continue to develop. And then maybe by then he's ready for the primary backup role behind Bam Adebayo. But so I could see maybe Omer Yurtseven getting minutes later on in the season. But right now, he's still, to me at least, falls under the developmental category for this roster.
It's crazy to me. He's less than 12 months younger than Bam Adebayo. Like that's pretty crazy to me, considering where they are in their careers. That's pretty wild. Now, speaking of Bam, last season, one of the things that I did get right when analyzing the Heat and the NBA was that the Bam Adebayo was going to lose a ton of ball handling opportunities and a ton of assist opportunities, and that all went away because Kyle Lowry was getting the ball and doing a lot more with it. We saw Bam's usage go up, but those assist numbers, which were so key to some of his fantasy value, that they just disappeared and they just didn't run offense through him. Do you think there's any change in that this season?
I think they're going to try to utilize Bam a lot more in the offense. It kind of reminds me of everything that LeBron says about Anthony Davis recently. Hey, we're going to run the offense through Anthony Davis. And the reason that the Lakers want to do that, and LeBron specifically wants to do that, is to sort of keep the load off of him a little bit more in the regular season, and so that he's ready to go by the playoffs. And I think you could see a little bit of that happening in this regular season for Miami. Hey, let's take a little bit more off of Jimmy Butler's plate. Let's take a little bit more even off of Kyle Lowry's plate, and really put most of this stuff on Bam Adebayo and Tyler Herro, the young guys with the young legs, to at least carry us through that regular season. Obviously, Jimmy and Kyle are going to get theirs, right? But I could see them trying to force feed Bam a little bit more. But they really want him to just score. And the most enlightening maybe part of Pat Riley's end of season press conference was talking about Bam Adebayo, and he gave a very specific number. He said he wants to get Bam Adebayo 15 efficient shots per game, and that would be up about 2 or 3 shots per game from where Bam was last year. That's quite a bit. But what is an efficient shot, right? That's sort of the question that remark begs. And so to me, it's not a 3-point shot, not for Bam, even though he's been experimenting with that over the summer. We just wake me up when we start seeing that regularly in a regular season game, because that has not been the case for his career. And I don't necessarily know that it's the mid-range game, although they want him to continue to work on that little 15-footer and get better at that and start to hover around that 40% mark from that range. But to me, it just means at the basket, right? That's an efficient look. If you can get him more on those pick and roll opportunities at the rim, where he's finishing at the rim and above the rim, that's the best version of Bam Adebayo when you're getting him closest to the basket. Now, how do you do that? Well, you involve him in the pick and roll. You involve him in those dribble handoffs. You involve him in all that stuff that, to your point, they started to take away from him a little bit last year to get Kyle Lowry more involved. I think they're going to put more of that on his plate. And if you put him more in those high post actions, he's going to find more playmaking opportunities, but he's also going to find more opportunities to get downhill and get to the rim. And so theoretically, ideally, that's what would happen.
It is going to be really intriguing because he did see a real change in his role. The assist down usage went up. He averaged over 19 points per game. He's still really useful. He's one of those centers, though, that interestingly just doesn't block really any shots. He averaged 0.8 blocks, which is pretty bad. But usage was up at 25, which is something we'd never seen from him. So it was a real change in his overall game and statistical distribution. But we've talked about a guy who's locked in as a starter, is an all-star. What do we do with Duncan Robinson? What next? Because he signed that huge contract, 5 years, I think $80+ million. He was a starter, and then he's out of the rotation, and you're expecting him to be basically out of the rotation most nights here again. Is like what happened, and where does he go? He's one of those guys that I talk about a lot on this show. Is that when someone comes in and they're a 44% 3-point shooter, you love it. It's great. He's excellent. But then if you drop off and become 40%, that's still really good. But what else do you do? But he went even worse. So he shot 36%. And when you do actually nothing else, then you don't have a spot because you become a league average 3-point shooter. I expect the 3-point shooting goes up, but like what is it? What the hell happened?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Once you take away that elite level, top 1% of the league 3-point shooting, he's not good defensively. He fouls way too much. So he has to be taken off the floor even when he does get minutes. He's an okay rebounder, not a good one. And he's not very threatening off the ball or off the dribble. And that's an area where Max Strus does thrive, right? Max Strus is an underrated ball handler. Max Strus is a pretty decent rebounder at his size. And so you just sort of and then defensively, he was just better than Duncan Robinson by the end of the season, even though I don't know that was the case at the beginning of the season. But as Max Strus developed, he became better at all these other things. And by the way, he was shooting the ball better than Duncan Robinson was too. And so you saw him ascend and leap over Duncan Robinson in the depth chart. And I see no reason for that to change. Duncan Robinson has his work cut out for him in training camp. He is going to have to prove that he has gotten better at all those other questionable areas and that 3-point shot is back to a top 1% in the league type of level. Because if it's not, I don't see the pathway to minutes. Now, in the regular season, maybe Eric Spoelstra will go 10 or 11 deep in the rotation. And if he does, then yeah, probably Duncan Robinson sees some minutes, but it's not going to be a lot of them. Right. And it'll probably be mostly front loaded at the first half of games. And then once the second half rolls around and Miami's trying to win those games, he starts to come off the floor, as was the case last season. So to me, I'm interested to see what happens with Duncan Robinson. He's obviously the most logical trade candidate on this roster. I do think that they were holding on to him for quite a bit while they were waiting for the Kevin Durant and the Donovan Mitchell things to sort of play out, because his big salary at about $19 million would have been needed, presumably, to facilitate a deal for one of those superstar players. But now that those superstar players are off the table, at least we expect Donovan Mitchell to be pretty soon, do you then shop Duncan Robinson a little bit more? Can we go move his money for maybe an answer at power forward, or maybe some depth in that power rotation or something like that? Can you move Duncan Robinson now that you don't really need that chunky contract as much as you had when you were waiting for these other things to play out? He's the logical guy to get moved and try to upgrade some other spots of the roster.
Who's a breakout candidate on this team?
It's a good question. I think it could be Gabe Vincent. They really trusted him down the stretch. And I always say, actions speak louder than words. Like coaches will tell you who they like without telling you. And you just look at the minutes as the season went on, and specifically in the playoffs, especially when Kyle Lowry had to miss time, they were cool running Gabe Vincent out there.
Yep.
They were good with it. Like, hey, he's our starting point guard, and we got enough. And they did in those first few rounds when they had to rely on him. And so he's going to be your primary backup point guard. With Kyle Lowry getting older, you could see his minutes maybe come down and Gabe Vincent's minutes continue to go up. We'll see again, going back to what we were talking about with Lowry and his off the court things that he's dealing with. If he has to miss time, they're comfortable starting Gabe Vincent, so he could be a spot starter here and there, and obviously get the lion's share of the minutes at that point. And the other part of his game that's interesting is that the Heat brought him in, and he was like sort of more of an off the ball score first kind of guard when they acquired him, and they sort of molded him into this sort of traditional one ball handling point guard who can defend his position. They molded him into that. I could see them, with the need for more scoring, start to take the reins off of the scoring part of his game a little bit more and empower him to be more of a scorer, especially in that second unit. If Tyler Herro is not going to be a part of it, they're going to need more scoring in that unit too. So I think Gabe Vincent could be that breakout, and I wouldn't sleep on Tyler Herro. He took a huge leap last year. I just do wonder if there's going to be a leap this year. You made a good point earlier, like doing it against starters with maybe having to share the ball a little bit more could drop those numbers, but the efficiency might go up because those efficiency numbers went up quite a bit last year. If he could take another leap, the efficiency could be a breakout for him. But in terms of your question, to me, if I was going to look at a breakout guy, it would be Gabe Vincent.
Sacramento Kings legend Gabe Vincent. What about a regression candidate?
I hate to say it, but doesn't it feel like it would be Max Strus, right? Like, how real is it? Is this going to be Duncan Robinson 2.0? I don't know. I don't know.
I believe in Max. I believe in him.
I believe in Max too, man. That's why I said I hate to say it, but I'm trying to look like up and down the roster. Like, if there is a regression candidate, it could be Tyler Herro, right? It could go the other way. I believe in the work that he's put in. It's hard to say Kyle Lowry would be a regression just because of where he was last year. Jimmy Butler's regular season numbers were okay. Like, they weren't great. So I don't really know who the regression person would be. But if Max Strus goes, like you said, from a 40-something% three-point shooter to something slightly less, I think he'll still get minutes because he could do other things, but that would qualify to me at least as a regression.
Is this team better than last season?
No.
Simple. All right. I think we've answered this next question as well. Who's the most likely player to be traded?
Yeah, it is Duncan Robinson. And then you look, I'll say also Victor Oladipo, we're throwing his name in there. Another guy who was signed to initially a one-year deal with the early bird rights, which effectively gave him a no-trade clause, essentially, even though it's not technically that. Miami, I think, realized that and renegotiated that contract to be a 2-year deal, thereby taking away that no-trade clause, that insinuated no-trade clause. And so, and that's another one I mentioned, sort of a chunky contract, the way that they signed Dwayne Dedmon to. They gave Victor Oladipo an above-market chunky contract hovering around $9 million as well. And so if Oladipo shows out in the early parts of the season and Miami looks to maybe upgrade a roster with a 2-for-1 type of deal, Victor Oladipo might end up being the centerpiece of a deal like that if that person is not Duncan Robinson, a player that like another team would actually be interested in. If Oladipo shows out, you could see him filling a need for quite a few different teams who might need a scoring threat off the bench who could play some defense. You could pair Oladipo with a Dwayne Dedmon or a Caleb Martin salary. That's a nice kind of $10, $12, $13 million salary that you could move to go ahead and acquire maybe a starting caliber power forward or something like that. And so Victor Oladipo, I think, is also a prime candidate to be traded.
Let's get to some fun quiz questions to end this, Wes. These are the talent grades from Basketball Index: three-point shooting talent, playmaking talent, and finishing talent. This is from last season, and it's not just who had the highest three-point percentage. It's about difficulty of shots, contested shots, pull-up shots versus catch and shoot, the difficulty there. Basically, who do you think is the best three-point shooter? Finishing is, getting to the rim, driving, that sort of thing, finishing through contact, your finishing talent there, and playmaking is about assists, but potential assists, the versatility of passes, the location of passes, that sort of thing. So I just want to see how the hosts of these shows can, how they view the team versus what those numbers would have spat out. So who do you think would have graded out as the best three-point shooting talent on this team last season?
Just a heads up really quick. I'm horrible at trivia. I don't watch Jeopardy because it makes me feel bad about myself. So let's see. I think 3-point shooting, the way you described it, I think that's actually going to be Tyler Herro.
It is Tyler Herro. 1 for 1, Wes. There you go. You're on a roll. What about playmaking talent?
This one's tough. Is it Kyle Lowry?
It is. That's 2 for 2 from you, Wes. Now, let's have a look at this next one. Oh, okay. I reckon you might get this one as well. You might. Finishing talent. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, it's got to be one of two guys, and I'm gonna go. I'll go with Jimmy. I'll go with Jimmy here.
Wes Goldberg, 3 for 3 on these questions. Let's see if you can finish off with our final trivia question. How many times has Jimmy Butler played in at least 70 games in an NBA season?
Whole career, or just with the Heat?
Whole career.
Whole career. Twice.
Wes Goldberg, that is exactly correct. In 12-13, when he came off the bench, that's his second year, and in 16-17, he has done it exactly 0 times for Miami. He just gets hurt. That's just what happens to Jimmy Butler. He just misses time, and so we are 6 years removed from Jimmy Butler playing in 70 games in an NBA season. You just dominated that, Wes, so I really appreciate your brilliance there. Thank you for coming on Locked On Fantasy Basketball. What's going on at Locked On Heat at the moment?
We are going through all the Kevin Durant, the fallout of that. What happens with the Heat's roster next? Where can they go? And who's the next superstar that they're going to be chasing? Because we know that's Pat Riley's MO. He has always got an eye on the next superstar that could shake loose. So that's what we've been talking about.
Go and check out Locked On Heat with David and Wes. Wes, thanks for coming on and chatting about the Miami Heat with me.
Thanks for having me.
And that will do it for me today. Don't forget to follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and on the Odyssey app. If you are here on YouTube, thumb it up and leave your comments down below. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.